Well, good afternoon to those of you joining us in the United States. Good evening in Europe, and hello around the world, no matter where you are. I'm Jeff Rathke. I'm the president of the American Institute for Contemporary German Studies at Johns Hopkins University, and I'm really delighted to welcome all of you to this discussion on the German election and transatlantic security. I am firmly of the view that the election that will happen on September 26th is the most important election happening anywhere in the world this year. That is true, of course, for economic policy, for climate policy, and for a whole host of other areas of public interest, not least the COVID-19 pandemic, but it's also especially true for transatlantic security. Here in the United States, of course, there is an American administration led by President Biden that has emphasized revitalizing alliances and strengthening America's international partnerships. And that means naturally that the United States allies, especially those like Germany, play an important role in Washington's view of the world. Now, I think it's also worth noting that if you look at the opinion polls in Germany, you see a significant volatility since the start of the campaign through today. And the fact that even small changes in the support of one party or another can either close off or open up new options of coalition and coalition possibilities. So I'm really delighted to have with us today three terrific experts who will help us try to understand where Germany is headed when it comes to foreign security and defense policy, what that means for Germany's neighbors and partners, and how we can make sense of all of that. It's true that the campaign perhaps has not focused too much on foreign affairs issues up to this point, but I think there is a lot of information out there, and we will go through that with you. One or two notes about today's session. We will be using the Q&A function in Zoom. I'm sure everybody is extremely familiar with it by now, but just a reminder to use the Q&A button if you would like to offer a view and pose a question. Also, a request from my side, if you can make the question as succinct as possible. That makes it a lot easier for me as moderator to incorporate it into our conversation. So with that, let me just introduce our speakers and we will get right to it. Our first expert today is Sophia Besch. I'm extremely proud to say that she is a visiting fellow here at AICGS. It is not her only incarnation, though. She is a senior research fellow at the Center for European Reform, and she is working on her PhD at King's College in London. And it's part of that research that we're delighted to host you here. In fact, she is about 20 meters away from me in a different office. So welcome, Sophia. We also have with us Dr. Ulrike Franke, who is a senior policy fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations. She is an expert on security and defense, the future of warfare, and the impact of new technologies on geopolitics and warfare. She is also a co-host of the Sicherheitshalber podcast, which for those of you who are German speakers and care about security policy should be on your subscription list. Welcome, Rika.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Jeff.
And we also have with us Ambassador Janusz Reiter. He was Poland's ambassador to the United States. He was Poland's ambassador to Germany. He is the founder and chairman of the Center for International Relations in Warsaw, and someone with decades of experience in transatlantic and European relations. Ambassador Reiter, thanks so much for making time with us today.
Thank you very much for having me.
Okay, so I thought we would get started by talking, first of all, about, let's say, the ground truth in Germany and the directions that German politics is taking when it comes to international security. From an American perspective, I think there's a widespread acceptance that the principal elements of international relations are either great power competition, if you want to put it in the phrase that the Trump administration used, or to use the Biden administration's terminology, rivalry between democracies and autocracies. Now, you can debate the differences between those two things, but that's not our purpose here today. I think that what they have in common is the idea that the international system is increasingly contested, that the advantages that the United States and its the advanced democracies that form the core of our allies and partners, that our advantages are increasingly vulnerable, and that from an American point of view, that part of the solution to dealing with that situation is strengthen partnerships with countries like Germany and our European friends and allies. So I'd like to start just by understanding a little bit better whether German political forces see the world in the same way, or are there differences in how they look at the world? Enrique, I wanted to turn to you first. Is that a view that's a vision that's shared from your point of view?
Yeah, so I think that very broadly speaking, I would say that this vision that we are increasingly in a world that is impacted by a great power competition, or indeed this fight between democracies and autocracies, that view is something that's relatively widely shared in the political, let's call it the political establishment in Germany. When you read the kind of party programs, right? All the parties that are running for the Bundestag have put out party election programs to prepare for this. And when you read the security and defense, or the foreign policy and defense bits, they pretty much all start with this statement that, you know, the world has changed and there's a new challenge happening here, and they all point to the competition between US and China. So very broadly speaking, I think this is understood. The question is, how do the different parties react to this challenge, and whether there are differences there? And I think there are a few. So, I mean, first of all, maybe the one outlier in this analysis is the Linke party, the kind of extreme left, simply because although they mention this kind of increasing geopolitical competition, they basically blame all sides equally. So they really see that, you know, you have these imperialist powers, and it's basically the same whether it's China or Russia or the US. They're all, you know, equally bad, and we need to kind of get rid of this whole idea. Apart from the Linke, I think the parties see this slightly different. So I think most of the let's call it the center parties, kind of the four parties in the center, have a somewhat similar reaction to the challenge insofar as they basically all prescribe to a statement that I think is originally CDU, but again kind of works for all, which is the answer to this challenge should be to remain transatlantic, but become more European, right? All the parties basically say the relationship with the US is really important. Of course, the security relationship first and foremost, but also in general, the US is an important partner. Again, there are some differences. Maybe the CDU is most outspoken about this. Others talk a little bit more about reframing and reimagining the relationship, but overall, the kind of transatlantic element is there. And the European element is there, because there is this idea that, okay, well, the US is a bit less interested in Europe and a bit more interested in, say, China, or kind of in its internal affairs. So we may have to do more things at the European level. And so, yeah, very big picture, I'd say broad agreement if you leave out the extreme left or indeed the extreme right, which also has some weird pro-Russian views. Remain transatlantic, become more European, and then you kind of go into the nitty-gritty, and then the question becomes like, okay, so how much Europe, how much EU, etc. And maybe just as a final point, what I found quite striking is that all the parties emphasize the European and the EU's role. I think of the four parties in the middle, the CDU has the most clearest statement about Germany as an actor, and Germany as a kind of anchor. I think they call it an anchor in the global world or something like this, while the others still go even more to the European level. But these are differences in nuance, and there will be a question of how much you will be able to see them if we end up in like a three-party coalition or something like that.
Okay. Thanks, Rika. I gave Rika the opportunity at self-promotion and she did not take it. So I will say on her behalf that she has published today, you can find it on the website of the ECFR, an analysis called Foreign and Defense Policy in the German Election, which goes through the party platforms in some detail. So for those who are interested, I certainly highly recommend it. Now, to turn to you, Sophia, do you share this view of the kind of convergence of mainstream German parties when it comes to their view of the world? How do you see it?
Thank you. Thanks, Jeff, and thanks for having me. So yes and no. I think it's a really interesting question. I think the answer is more interesting than it might appear at first sight, because at first sight, we have this broad surface level consensus on foreign policy in Germany. The main parties, and like Rika, I would say, the four centrist parties, so everyone except the far left or the far right. The four frontrunner parties agree on this idea of Germany as an inclusive power, an honest broker, a mediator, a passionate multilateralist, committed to the EU, committed to NATO, okay? Then you enter into the election campaign and you get some hot button issues that might win you a couple of quick points. And this is where parties will revel in their disagreements over issues like the 2% defense spending, Nord Stream 2, or armed drones, even though Rika might disagree and argue that this is actually the single most important issue. But then there are structural issues, right? The shortfalls, the dilemmas, the difficult decisions that lie ahead for German foreign policy, and that all parties, I think, would prefer not to talk about, and that we haven't talked much about in the election campaign. And this is where we get into some of the questions that Ulrike and you have raised already. So in the foreign policy realm, the next German government is going to have to chart a course that balances between this transatlantic link and the commitment to the EU. And it will have to reform the German stance vis-a-vis China. And then flowing from this, the German government will face decisions about defense policy, right? About long-term spending plans, about the value of the military as a foreign policy instrument, about the future of military interventions, about the future of nuclear sharing. This is where we get into the fundamental assumptions, as you say, and this is where it gets interesting, and this is what we should talk about in this panel. Let me perhaps just briefly mention the German relationship with the two major powers, the US and China, because that I'm assuming is most interesting to the transatlantic audience. As Rike has said, there's no serious German policymaker that argues with the fact that Germany's security depends on the political military link with the United States. At the same time, most are aware of the US reorientation away from Europe and the European neighborhood. And so the fundamental challenge for the next chancellor is going to be to decide the level of dependence and autonomy between Germany on the one side and Europe, and then the United States on the other side. And Rike has mentioned the official German slogan, which is beautifully vague, right? Stay transatlantic while becoming European. That's hard to argue with, but in practice, I think parties differ. So the CDU embraces the call for stronger EU foreign policy, but especially under Defense Minister AKK has been really committed to NATO, at times quite EU skeptic, signaling wherever possible their alignment with the US, attacking the strategic autonomy narrative. The SPD calls for an EU army, the German evergreen, but it also presents itself as the German peace party, right? They're much more skeptical vis-a-vis the US. They call for a fundamental new start in the transatlantic relationship. They oppose Germany's role in nuclear sharing. They're essentially in favor of building a more capable EU as a peace power. FDP, quite federalist in its EU ambitions, wants to create a European Defense Union, a European army, coming, I think, from a position of enabling Europeans to act without the US if they're asked to do so. And then the Greens, passionately pro-EU, in favor of creating more military capable EU, but skeptical of the EU's actual defense industrial efforts. So we can expect perhaps a reality check there on arms exports, the European Defense Fund, AFCAS. Now, from a US perspective, your view on this might be that the format for action doesn't really matter as much as long as Europeans take more responsibility for their own neighborhoods, along the lines of my favorite Erich Kästner quote, "Es gibt nichts Gutes außer man tut es." Nothing is good unless you do it. But the parties in Germany differ on how to get there, right? And you can pick your fighter according to what you think is the right way forward. Where the results of this question of European ability to act will really show, of course, is in the relationship with China. And just really briefly, I think here the German foreign policy consensus has been changing over the last circa 2 years. China policy under Merkel was shaped by yes, economic interests and by this belief in change through trade. And she has been criticized for this naive mercantilism quite a bit. But Berlin under Chancellor Merkel also followed the rationale that China's influence in the international system would have to eventually be accommodated, and the hope that mutual interdependence could function as a de-escalating force. And so Berlin has pushed for dialogue and engagement with China and has warned of the risks of isolating Beijing. And these arguments have really informed, I think, the broader European compartmentalized approach vis-a-vis China. So this idea of treating the country as cooperation partner, economic competitor, systemic rival. Merkel was the chief architect of that approach. And all parties, again, with the exception of the Linke and the AfD, explicitly subscribe to this line. As you will see if you read Rike's piece, I read the party programs as well. They all mention this line, but they differ, I think, in their weighing of the different elements. So for the Green Party, which has embraced this really strongly human rights-led foreign policy program, China's role in the security crackdown in Hong Kong, the treatment of the Uyghurs, have led them to embrace this US normative narrative of confrontation between authoritarianism and democracies. But they get there, and I think that's important, from a different angle, right? While people here in Washington may think first about systemic geopolitical confrontation, the Greens focus on human rights and democracy, taking almost a civil society approach to foreign policy, right? The SPD really stresses the necessity of a European approach. And I think incidents, especially like the outsized Chinese reactions to EU sanctions, have led them to alter their perception of China, but they shy away a bit more from the green confrontational rhetoric and want to hold on to the traditional German role of consensus builder, advocate for dialogue. And then CDU and FDP are responding to the Biden message that they want to coordinate China policy with the Europeans. They're least willing to incur economic costs, most willing, I think, to at least symbolically participate in military signaling. See the frigate Bayern and the port visit that wasn't. There's some things happening there right now. Yeah. So on this all-defining China issue, I would guarantee that we will see change under the next German government, but with clear nuances on which way it'll go. And I'll end here with the first taste of some of the nuances in party programs. I'm sure we'll get into it more in the Q&A.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'd like to turn. I'll come to Ambassador Reiter in just a minute, but the first thing I wanted to do is to put on the table the two most likely governments that I think we could expect to see after this election, and just to talk with Rike and Sophia about what they might mean in very, in very kind of telegraphic short terms. Because what we want to understand is, does it make a difference? Does it make a difference for people outside of Germany whether Olaf Scholz is leading a coalition with the Greens and the Liberal Free Democratic Party, so-called Ampelkoalition, or a government led by Armin Laschet of the CDU alongside the Greens and the FDP, so-called Jamaica coalition. So Rike, I want to turn to you first. Does it make a difference, or what would we expect? What would you expect from a government led by Armin Laschet on these security issues that would distinguish it?
Yeah. So interestingly enough, the leaders themselves don't matter as much, insofar as, I would say, broadly speaking,
the anticipation is great because Rika's screen has frozen for a second. While we, there we are.
You've got me back. All right, I may turn the video just to make sure. So yeah, I was just saying. So very briefly, I don't think that the leaders will matter as much as one may think, because the three leaders are a bit middle of the road candidates for their parties. But of course, the coalitions matter quite a bit. And I'd say, to put it in a nutshell, the kind of two main differences you may have between a coalition led by the SPD and a coalition led by the CDU when it comes to defense and security is on the 2% defense spending, 2% of GDP spending on defense, and the question of Germany's participation in NATO's nuclear sharing. So on the 2%, I think that a CDU-led government will try at least harder to get towards the 2%. Now, to be honest, we've had 16 years of a CDU-led government and haven't met the 2%. So I wouldn't exactly predict that we're going to end up with 2% anytime soon under Laschet either. But I think there will be more of a willingness to try. I think in an SPD-led government that may be less the case. But I think the most important issue really, and it is absolutely striking that A, we're not really discussing it, and B, the parties aren't even really taking stances on this in their party programs, is nuclear sharing and Germany's role in NATO's nuclear sharing. Because I would say under a Laschet-led, so a CDU-led coalition, Germany is going to try to stay in NATO's nuclear sharing, which means acquire aircraft that can carry US nuclear weapons. So currently that's the case at the moment. These aircraft are getting old, however, so Germany will need to take a decision on whether or not to continue this. If we get an SPD-led coalition, I think it's not entirely clear whether this will happen. Because, you know, we are talking about a coalition of parties that are all rather critical of, well, nuclear weapons in general and nuclear sharing. And having these parties decide to spend millions, if not billions, on aircraft to carry US nuclear weapons, well, I'm less certain about this. And I think that would actually be quite a big, directional decision, if you like, in Germany. So yeah, on this one issue, I'd say there may actually be a real difference that matters for NATO and matters to the US.
Okay, thanks, Rika. Sophia, turning to you. If we were to imagine a government led by Olaf Scholz with the Greens and the FDP, what would you consider to be its key characteristics when it comes to security and over to you.
Yeah, thank you. I think actually I subscribe fully to what Ulrike just said. I was nodding along. I think 2% and nuclear sharing are going to be the two main differences that are relevant from a transatlantic perspective. So if you allow me, I will maybe just talk a little bit about why this question is a bit difficult to answer in the current context of the German electoral landscape, right? Because if we're being intellectually serious, there are a couple of points that make the actual foreign policy of the next government quite difficult to predict. One is about the fact that German elections get most interesting in the weeks and months after the election, right? Because this is when the coalition treaty is being negotiated. This is when compromises need to be struck. And this is when it no longer really matters how you as a party feel about foreign policy and what you would like to do, but also how much you prioritize it, meaning how much you're willing to give up to get your way on foreign policy. And some of the parties that we're discussing here don't, I think, prioritize foreign policy as much that they would fight for it in coalition negotiations. This is also where ministries get distributed. And to really make a difference, you need to agree on a course between the defense ministry, the finance ministry, if we're talking about defense spending, and the foreign ministry at least. So it matters which parties get them, right? Even within the coalition. And then second, as many others have noted, the most interesting difference on foreign policy views this year almost have not been between the parties, but within the parties, right? So all three leading parties, CDU, SPD, and Greens, have put forward their centrist candidate, their Merkel candidate, but all three have more extreme factions in their own parties. The Greens have the age-old division between the pragmatists and the left wing. They've been pretty successful in uniting behind a centrist leadership. The SPD has a more left-wing party leadership, especially left-wing on foreign policy issues, but has put forward a centrist candidate. The CDU too, for that matter, has a strand of the party that is pulling in the more conservative direction with Friedrich Merz. So in a traffic light coalition, I think under Chancellor Scholz, there's a question mark over whether the SPD and the Greens would be able to maintain their centrist party discipline. My hunch is that the pragmatists in SPD and Greens would be reinforced by the Liberals' own quite centrist foreign policy positions. And then finally, there is the Chancellor question. How much difference will this next Chancellor actually make? Because Merkel has become, certainly towards the end of her tenure, a very powerful stateswoman, but she was never particularly interested in foreign and defense policy. She has not given landmark speeches. She has invested very little political capital into developing the German position, right? She wasn't actively involved in the Munich consensus. Her famous beer tent speech words, Europe will in the future at times perhaps take its fate in its own hands. That's really one of the most directional statements statements we ever got from here. So if Olaf Scholz is the next chancellor, he might not have her standing or her influence, but he might be more interested in setting a course on foreign policy, especially I think if the Green Party, and the Green Party will almost certainly be in government, is prioritizing foreign policy in government as much as it has in the election campaign.
Okay, thank you. So Janusz Reiter, do you see from your perspective, how do you see the balance between continuity and change, especially in Germany's security policy in this election?
Well, it is fair to say that Germany has changed in its foreign and security policy in the past 30 years. Germany is often criticized for not changing, for neglecting, for denying the realities. But this is not totally wrong, but this is a little bit unfair. However, I think it's not unfair to say that the world has changed even more than Germany has in the past 30 years. So there is a problem of potential or real incompatibility of the German security thinking and foreign policy thinking and the rules of global relations. I think this is something that the Germans have to take very seriously. Some people in Germany, by the way, believe that this incompatibility should be a source of pride. And of course, if you see it that way, then you don't make any effort to address the problem because you believe that the problem is actually no problem. It is your advantage. But I would say that the majority doesn't share this way of thinking. Well, I believe Germany has a problem of a double gap. First, there is a gap that the German political elite is not quite compatible with the political establishments of the leading Western powers like the US or France. And this is, by the way, going to be a problem in Europe between Germany and France. And I think France is concerned about a growing potential incompatibility between Germany and France. But there is even more a gap between the German establishment and the wider public in Germany. But if you talk to people in the German establishment, but they are very good at describing the world. They do understand the problems of the world, but they believe that they cannot just transform the description of the world in policies that would be accepted. And everybody knows that in Germany, if you are the government, you need even more public acceptance than in some other countries, more than in the US, more than in France, for example. And well, if I look at the election campaign from this point of view and ask myself, is this election campaign going to narrow these two gaps, and especially the gap between the elite, the establishment, and the wider public? Well, I'm not quite sure, frankly speaking. I'm afraid it is not really, this is not being touched, this is not being addressed. And this may be a problem for Germany in the post-election time. And of course, the post-election time is longer than the election time. So let me then say, well, does this election matter if that's the problem? And do the differences matter? And how relevant are these differences? I do agree with those who said that there is a general consensus in Germany. There has been a general consensus on the basic course of the country. However, there are different instincts in the different parties. And I think what is relevant is what instincts will we get after the election in the new government. And I believe that the sum of the instincts of, for example, the SPD and the Green Party with the FDP may be different from the sum of the instincts of the Green Party in a CDU-led coalition. So I do believe that not dramatically, not overnight, but in the long run, things may change in Germany, and it is not absolutely clear in what direction things will change. And finally, let me say, well, I think the problem is who is better prepared to get a stronger mandate for a more robust German foreign and especially security policy. And what some parties deny the problem, and some parties believe that this mandate should be widened. And I believe it should be widened because otherwise, well, Germany will have difficulties both in Europe and in the Transatlantic Alliance. Last word on the European sovereignty. I'm skeptical of that, not of the idea of strengthening Europe. I know, I'm listening every day in my own country to people speaking about sovereignty, people promising more sovereignty for the country as a result of their policies. And I always say, well, by talking about sovereignty, you will not get more sovereign. And what does it mean to be more sovereign? If it means getting more influence, if it means getting more power, okay, that's wonderful. But by talking about sovereignty, you will not get more influence, you will not get more power. And the European problem is that Europe does not have enough power and enough influence. And how we address this problem, I think this should be discussed very soberly. And I think the first address, so to speak, for this discussion should be NATO, but having in mind that we do have to strengthen Europe as part of the Transatlantic Alliance. Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you.
I see you've got your hand up, Rika, and I'll come to you in a second, but I wanted to follow up on one thing you said, Ambassador Reiter. And you highlighted as an example, the potential for disagreement or differing views between Germany and France. I wonder if you could say a little bit more about that. Where do you see the roots of that potential disagreement?
Well, look, but this is, for example, the question of the engagement in Africa. But France clearly needs the German support, and the problem is not how much military equipment Germany will send. The problem is how much Germany will share the concern about what is going on in Africa and will internalize the problem of Africa. And this is, I think this is the real problem, because as long as the Germans do not internalize this problem as their problem and not a French problem, but as a European problem, which of course means it is a German problem too. So there will be little progress. Under pressure, they may do a little bit more, but that's not what France expects. And then of course there are other issues where, again, well, Germany may expect more for France, and that's or where these two countries have to come to an agreement, but also including the eastern neighbors of Germany. That's the question of the eastern neighborhood, especially the critical question of how to deal with Russia. This is the question, of course, I didn't mention it, but that's the question that's dealing with will be a key issue for the next government.
Okay, thank you. And Rika, you had you had two fingers, so up. Yeah, so. Exactly, a short two fingers. So first of all, I think I disagree on the Franco-German element. I don't think that there's likely going to be more divergence. I mean, unless Marine Le Pen is getting elected, but then we have all kinds of problems in Europe. But I don't think, I mean, you know, the Franco-German relationship always has its ups and downs, and there are certainly issues, but I'm not too worried about this at the moment. But the very short two fingers that I had, number one, on kind of the role of German public opinion when it comes to security and defense. On the one hand, I think it's absolutely correct that yes, the German population, I mean, cares even less about foreign and security policy than maybe other populations, and really doesn't like anything related to the military. And so So all kind of governments have kind of struggled with that. At the same time, I also increasingly get the impression that politicians like to use this pacifist German public as a bit of an excuse, right? Because it's kind of easy to say, oh, we can't sell this to our public, so we can't do it. And I always feel that actually, if Germany really wanted to do certain things, it could not sell it to the public, but kind of explain it to the public better and can kind of start a little bit of change there. So this is just for people to keep in mind. And then the second point on China policy, because I agree that we are slowly having a bit of a development in Germany's view with regard to China. There's a lot of things happening. We, however, at ECFR, we just carried out a really interesting poll among, I think, in 12 or 16 European countries. And one of the questions was whether Germany can lead Europe in different foreign policy areas. And basically the Europeans said like, oh yeah, Germany can lead Europe and the EU on human rights. It can kind of lead on economic and financial questions. But pretty much no one thought that Germany could lead Europe on the big geopolitical questions, and especially on China. I think it was like 17% or so who said that, yeah, Germany will lead Europe on China and on building a kind of better relationship with China, or rather kind of defining a better European stance with regard to China. And that I thought was A, quite striking, and B, probably correct.
Thank you. I want to also turn back to Ambassador Reiter. And of course, there has been in the last few weeks a focus internationally on the withdrawal of the United States and its allies from Afghanistan, and this has also unleashed a kind of European debate as well, and maybe we'll wind up talking about that today. But the thing I wanted to ask you, Ambassador, one of the fears that many have expressed is that this might somehow call into question the reliability of the U.S. security guarantee in a NATO context. From your perspective, do you see the U.S. commitment to transatlantic security strengthened or weakened by the developments of the last several?
Well, first, this is not the first war the U.S. has lost. Just to put it in a wider context. Second, I don't remember who that was, but I think it was Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer who said, and I think she's right, if we are so weak, if our contribution is so limited, how can we expect to be treated, to be better treated than we are? I think that's the point. The more Europe has to offer, and the more Europe has to contribute, the more it can expect another way of being treated. So I would not see that as a turning point. But this is, of course, the way this decision was executed that was unfortunate. And of course, this may be also used in some countries, and especially maybe in Germany, to strengthen doubts about the US. But I think if you look soberly at the realities, then the right answer is yes, we need a stronger Europe. And if you like, then you can call it European sovereignty. But it's a question. It's a label. We may have this wonderful label, European sovereignty, but no more power, no more influence, and then we cannot expect any changes in the U.S. behavior. The U.S. is a great power, and I mean the Europeans, I think, are realizing more and more that they may complain about the US, but they may end up in a situation where they will be treated in a totally different way by other major powers in the world.
Mm-hmm. Ambassador, let me ask, because both Sophia and Rika have identified nuclear sharing as a potential issue for the next German coalition, depending on its composition. And so, with apologies for the siren in my background here, I want to ask how you view what would be the significance of a change in Germany's approach to nuclear sharing in a European context?
I believe that this would be almost the worst case scenario, because the symbolism of this decision would be enormous, and the potential consequences, the potential implications would be enormous. In real military terms, this may appear to be irrelevant, but in political terms, this would be a wrong signal in the wrong time. So I hope this will not be done, and I'm quite confident it will not be done. I think this is a very, very serious issue. And by the way, I mean, I do not believe that the French, for example, would be happy about that, because unlike Germany, the French have their own nuclear doctrine, and they know that they cannot fill the vacuum that we would get in Europe if we break with the nuclear sharing in Europe. So I hope this will not come, and I believe this would be a disaster.
Could Poland step in? Could Poland basically, because I've heard some polls say, well, if Germany doesn't want the US nuclear weapons and be a part of nuclear sharing, we may take it. And I'm just wondering whether this is in any way, an option.
I mean, this is not a real option after all, because this would contribute to a division of Europe, and a deep division of Europe. And if we get such a division in Europe, then the question is, what is the future of the North Atlantic Alliance? If we have within the alliance such a deep divide between two countries, in this case, Germany and Poland, and maybe also some other countries in Central Europe. No, this is not a good idea.
Sophia, let me ask you to come in on this, because you were talking about the challenges that an SPD-led government would face, and on the one hand, I think you highlighted the conflicts especially within the Green Party and within the Social Democratic Party when it comes to the nuclear issue, different schools of thought. And at the same time, Germany has seen its European vocation in bridging differences within Europe. And I think the nuclear issue is one, as Ambassador Reiter was just describing. If you had a German government to take a fundamentally different position on NATO's nuclear policy, that would, it might be satisfying to some in Germany, but it would be deeply divisive in Europe. So how do you see that? Do you think there's a real possibility that a government could emerge that will want to change this policy?
So the nuclear issue is a really interesting, very ideological issue in Germany, right? Whether that's nuclear weapons or it's nuclear energy, it's really hard to have a rational debate about that in Germany. And it's been particularly hard for the Green and the SPD for different reasons, I think. The Greens' history, legacy, they're an anti-nuclear party, they were an anti-nuclear peace party in the very beginning. And the SPD has been skeptical of a confrontational stance vis-a-vis Russia at times. I think that the Green Party in particular has managed quite a feat in its party program on the nuclear issue, because they express their skepticism of nuclear arms in general. They are in favor of disarmament, but they leave a door open, right? They say that they are in favor of the removal of US bombs from German soil, but only if Germany's Central and Eastern European neighbors can be reassured and are reassured that Germany will still stand up for their security and defense, even without taking part in NATO's nuclear sharing arrangement. If you really think about that, and if you've listened to the ambassador right now, that would take a lot to reassure Germany's Central and Eastern European neighbors. And so you might take that as a hint towards how much the Greens are going to insist on actually getting rid of nuclear weapons once they're in power. I think they won't. I think you could certainly put pressure on the Greens by asking them what would they be willing to invest in terms of conventional defense capabilities to make up for the nuclear sharing arrangement. That would open up a broader debate that I'm not sure they're willing to have. So I'm pretty sure that they wouldn't prioritize this issue. The same with the SPD. Actually, they're skeptical. There are some factions in the SPD, as I've mentioned before, led by Rolf Mützenich and others, that are really very skeptical on this issue. There are questions over how powerful they would be in the next government, whether the SPD would be able to keep the peace and keep the really remarkable party discipline that they haven't shown over the last few years and that they've shown in this election campaign, keeping those voices down. Mm-hmm. I think the bigger risk is that Germany is, as our colleague, I think it's Claudia Major who has coined this phrase, sleepwalking out of the nuclear sharing arrangement, right? By not having this discussion, by not wanting to talk about the tornado replacement, just like it has happened in this last government where this decision was supposed to be made and then it was pushed to the next government cycle. And if it's pushed once more and if it's pushed once more, then the tornadoes will no longer be able to take part in the sharing arrangement. And then Germany has sleepwalked out of it.
Mm-hmm. To come back to the gap that Ambassador Reiter pointed to, is this an issue really for a small number of influential political leaders in those two parties, the Greens and the SPD? Does it have public resonance in your opinion?
So I agree with Rike that I also don't think that the main stumbling block to a more responsible German defense policy is the German public. But I do think, as I've hinted at, that the nuclear issue would require a party really investing a lot of political capital and making the argument for why Germany needs to be a part of this arrangement. And no party has done that for years. It hasn't really been part of the political discourse. It didn't need to be part of the political discourse. And I think if you look at the polls, if you look at surveys of German citizens, they will say, I'm in favor of the nuclear weapons-free world. I'm in favor of the global zero. And shouldn't Germany be a leader on this and be an example on this? And I think the argument that you would have to make is, and I think you can make this argument, is of the value of NATO for Germany, of the value of European unity and cohesion for Germany, and how important that the German participation in the nuclear sharing arrangement is from a solidarity perspective, from a European solidarity perspective, not the least, of course, from the actual security point, but we all know that the threat perception of the German public is small. They're not scared of Russia. But if you make the case for European solidarity and cohesion, I think you can win that argument.
Ambassador Reiter, I think you were about to offer some words.
Well, there are two ways to approach this difficult issue. One is not to talk about it. But as long as it is not openly questioned, you may avoid debates that could provoke opposition. But the other way is, of course, clearly openly addressing the issue and encourage public debate. Of course, you do encourage public debate if you believe that you will get the right results. I mean, you may understand, you may guess what I believe would be the right result. And of course, then the question is how likely are we to get the right result? However, I believe that what Germany needs is a debate, is a serious debate on the country's destiny in the world, if you like. It is not that Germany always made the key decisions the way they were made in the past 10 years. But a kind of national unity, if we remember the debates of the 1950s, Wiederbewaffnung, Westbindung, then Ostpolitik, all these debates were the result of passionate public debates. But the decisions that were made in the past years, Energiewende, for example, or Flüchtlingskrise, the refugee crisis, they were made in a kind of national consensus. I don't believe that this is the best way to make decisions. So people are, so the political elite is afraid of public debates. Well, I understand that, but I believe more and more that maybe Germany needs that. And then I think that the Germans have to understand that what many or some of them consider a German contribution to European or global peace will be understood as an expression of a German national egoism. And why? It is important for the Germans to understand why certain things are perceived differently in other countries than in Germany itself. So maybe this country needs it. Will we get that? I'm not sure, because I believe that the political establishment is, as I said, is afraid of political debates, which is a kind of distrust toward the public. But this is it is a tradition in Germany. People, the political elite distrusted the wider public. If you ask the people, you don't know what they will say. So it's better not to ask the people. I think this method has reached its limits.
We have a number of great questions popping up in the Q&A box. So thank you to our viewers. And I want to take a couple of those. And let me start with one by Walt Slocum, former Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. His question is, what, if anything, will this election mean for post-Brexit European relations with the UK on security issues? I may turn to you first, Rika, since you are located in London, but I will welcome reactions from any of our panelists.
Yes, not only am I located in London, I'm even talking to you from the Königswinter Defense Conference, which is a British-German discussion on defense, and it's this year it's the 10-year anniversary. So they've been talking about this for a long time, and I spent a day in these discussions, but I don't think that I have a clear answer to this question, because quite honestly, I don't think that it really matters for this specific topic, the kind of German-British or indeed EU-British defense cooperation, which government will be in power after, or will be elected after the 26th September, because I think they're all relatively aligned on the one hand, and also maybe more importantly, it strikes me that on these questions, the ball is much more in the UK's court. I mean, the UK did Brexit, and the UK is now kind of looking for its new place in the world with global Britain and all of this, and it really hasn't decided yet how to cooperate with the EU or bilaterally. So yeah, short answer, I don't think that this German election has an impact on the future of post-Brexit UK-German relations, but I find it incredibly difficult to predict the future of UK-German relations. And what I can predict doesn't look good, because we've already had discussions about the Brits being really annoyed by any kind of third country rules that the EU came up with when it comes to bringing in third countries into EU defense cooperation. So right now there seems to be quite a lot of bad blood, and not the best development. But on this, I don't really think that that it really matters whether it's CDU-led or SPD-led or anything else. All of these governments will basically try to keep a very EU focus in this question.
Okay, Janusz or Sophia, do you want to add anything to that?
Maybe just briefly, I think there are all parties in Germany have, I think even all of them say in their programs that they want a strong relationship with the UK, that they are committed to that. Some have tried to put forward institutional arrangements like a European Security Council that could keep the UK aligned. I do think it makes a slight difference how you feel about the EU versus NATO debate, because the UK has pretty clearly in its integrated review and its defense industrial strategy said that it wants to pursue especially defense industrial cooperation at a bilateral level with its European partners and through NATO. And there's a question about how open German parties will be to that. And if you believe, like, for example, the Greens do, that bilateral relations can undermine the momentum inside the EU for capability development, for military cooperation, then you might be less willing to engage with the UK at a bilateral level. You might be less willing to engage within NATO because that might undermine the EU. So I do think that these kind of complex institutional questions make a difference in practice to how they will meet each other. But at the broader political level, I agree with Ulrike.
Janusz.
Well, yeah, I believe that the chaotic Brexit made many Germans forget how important the British influence was in the German political culture. How important it was, especially in the German foreign policy thinking and security policy thinking, but not only that, this is now forgotten by many, but I believe that the time will come for many Germans to realize how much they need this British influence, also as an element of a balance between the French influence and, well, the Anglo-Saxon influence. So I believe that this is in German interest, and I will believe that sooner or later the Germans will come back to the British as a partner. And I hope that if something like a European sovereignty happens, the UK will be part of that. Then it can become something real and serious.
Okay, let me turn to another question. From my predecessor, Jack Janes. It's a question to you, Janusz, and he recalls that former Foreign Minister Sikorski once said that he was less concerned about German power than he was about German inaction. Are you concerned about German inaction in the post-Merkel period? And if so, to whom would you look for European leadership other than the Chancellor in Berlin?
Well, I may say that I'm more concerned about German inaction than about German power. I'm afraid my government sees it another way, but I hope that there will be a correction in Poland's foreign policy. Well, my fear is more and more that many Germans are not able to see the distinction between national decisions or the link between national decisions and European or international impact. And a lot of German decisions are being made unilaterally, but they have a major international impact. But given there was such an example, also the refugee crisis was such an example. Now we are, for example, facing in the EU a debate on the future of nuclear power in Europe. And again, I'm afraid that very often Germans are driven by a certain, well, kind of idealism, but a kind of unpolitical idealism that has very political impact. And I think it's important for Germany to be aware of the political impact of their decisions that they make nationally. And so the link between and the awareness of the influence that the country has in Europe, and especially, of course, on the neighbors.
Thanks. Next question relates to news that I think people will have noticed overnight about the announcement yesterday between the United States, the UK, and Australia with respect to Australia's procurement and operation of nuclear-powered submarines. And of course, there's been extreme French disappointment, really bitter disappointment. I think it's fair to say, because that upends a deal that France and Australia had just recently concluded. So the question is this possible breach between France and the United States going to affect how Germany looks at its security relationships? I think that assumes this will be a long-standing impact in Franco-American relations. But I'd just like to turn in particular to Ulrike and Sophia to get your opinions on whether this is going to affect German views of their European relationships and of European security.
Just very briefly, I think the concern in Germany right now after these news isn't so much, oh, there will be a breach or a kind of conflict between the US and France going forward, and what are we going to do about this? I think the concern is more, we thought that, Biden was all about the US is back, consultation with allies, Europe is playing an important role again, and now we have this deal, which of course, yes, it's all about allies, just about Australia and not about us or about France. And so I think Germans are looking at this thinking like, that's not quite what we expected when it comes to the transatlantic relationship. So yeah, that would be my reading. Honestly, I find it really difficult to speculate about, what happens if there's a real alienation between France and the US, and where will Germany sit. In the end, it remains always the fact that Germany really cares about the transatlantic relationship, emotionally, politically. It has to care because of the security and defense links. So they're not going to abandon this because France and the US are in conflict. And by the way, this has happened before. So this isn't the first time. But at the same time, yes, of course, the Franco-German relationship is the most important relationship in Europe for Germany. And actually, there's this discussion. And the new chancellor candidates have been asked this, like, where does your first trip abroad go? And I think, the correct answer is probably Paris. You could also say Washington, but this is indeed the kind of important question. But yeah, both of these relationships are important, and no matter what happens between France and the US, Germany will try to keep those very strong and very close. But again, I think the message just from this deal now was more about Germany kind of putting itself into France's shoes and thinking like, the US kind of did something here that wasn't too nice to France, and what does this mean for us, and what does this mean for the transatlantic relationship under Biden?
So I think this is what Germany does, right? Germany, when there's conflict between the French elements and the US, and Germany balances between the Franco-European strategic autonomy approach and the British. We're committed to NATO first, NATO primacy into the transatlantic approach. This is where Germany feels really comfortable, I think, in sort of negotiating that balance and that tension. So I wouldn't be too worried about that. I do think that this might reinforce some parts of the German security and defense debate that basically say, let's stay out of the Indo-Pacific, because it's not our area, it's not our responsibility. Not even the US is interested in the European allies becoming particularly invested there, with the exception of the UK, perhaps. So why would we? Let's focus on our neighborhood. I think that's one reading of this situation that I've already heard this morning from a couple of Germans I've spoken to about this. And then, I mean, it's up to you whether you think that's the right way forward.
Okay. We also have a question about the idea of European strategic autonomy. And of course, for those paying attention, France will hold the rotating presidency of the European Union in 2022. And so that could gain some prominence. But I want to approach this perhaps from an angle that Janusz Reiter identified already. And that is, talking about having power is very different from acquiring and exercising power. And so it seems to me, at least, that the European sovereignty debates are entirely disconnected from the question of resources that are necessary to truly acquire an independent European ability to act. I think people have looked at this, with respect to Afghanistan most recently. What would it have meant if European countries had decided they wanted to remain longer in Afghanistan than the United States? But I think more generally, I think it becomes even more stark. So I think my question then to the panelists is strategic autonomy really, in its full consequence, going to mark a future German government's approach, any government, or will it really just be lip service to the idea of Europe being better coordinated, perhaps, and more efficient, but not really acquiring the kind of power that would allow it to, act in some way autonomously.
Mm. I wanted to come in on this anyway. Sorry, if I may, because I wanted to react to Janusz' point about European strategic autonomy or sovereignty, and I really don't care which term you use, which has been an ongoing Franco-German discussion. So I must admit, I actually believe that talking about it is a very good first step. I have no issue with kind of, having this discussion first, and because you need to have this discussion before you can even talk about or create new capabilities. So I, very generally see the discussion about European strategic sovereignty as a positive development in Europe. It kind of has brought to the forefront certain different visions of what Europe should be able to do, which I think is quite good and healthy. And I do believe that it is the first step to actually also looking into capabilities. And this isn't just a defense question, it's also a question in the technological realm. We had Ursula von der Leyen's State of the Union yesterday, is that correct? Where she talked about building up a European semiconductor chip production. And this is very much about digital sovereignty. So I do believe that the fact that Europe is kind of looking to have a stronger ability to act in different areas is a positive development. I do not believe that it is a problematic development for the transatlantic relationship. And so I see this rather positively. The next German government, I mean, they will definitely pay lip service to it. Whether they will be really pursuing this goal, I mean, Germany, I think, will remain a bit of a mediator within the EU, or will try to remain a bit of a mediator within the EU, so it won't do the kind of French thing and really adopting this and kind of moving forward quickly with this. But I think most parties do at least in general subscribe to the idea, and maybe willing to create some more capabilities in this field. The Afghanistan, I must admit, I found the debate following the Afghanistan withdrawal in European strategic autonomy is a bit odd, because I don't think that a wholly sovereign Europe would have acted substantially different as it did in this Afghanistan withdrawal, meaning that very much like the US, the Europeans wanted to get out of Afghanistan. The Europeans were primarily in Afghanistan because of the US. So once the US left, it would also have left. So I find this link between the Afghanistan situation and European strategic capabilities or sovereignty slightly odd, but it definitely has supported the thinking in Europe and especially in Brussels, in the EU, that Europe needs to do more and needs more capabilities. So that's yet another push. But on that, honestly, I see the glass half full. That may just be my youthful optimism or something, but I keep that.
I think it's definitely, if I can just come in on this, Jeff, really briefly, I think there is something to be said for a generation of of scholars that hasn't had their heart broken quite as many times by the EU defense efforts yet as other previous generation may have had. I am very willing to use the new PC word for strategic autonomy, which is the European ability to act. So let's talk about the European ability to act, much less toxic. I'm not sure I quite agree, Jeff, with your characterization that we haven't focused on capabilities enough. I think what we've almost tried to do in recent years is put the cart before the horse and started talking about capabilities, at least at EU level, creating defense industrial capabilities, creating political and institutional decision-making structures, the qualified majority voting idea, PESCO, the European Defense Fund, without talking about strategy and without talking about what we actually want to do once we have those capabilities. And I think I agree with Rika, this is what we saw in Afghanistan. Some Europeans might have wanted to stay in, but there wasn't the German mandate had just been prolonged, but there wasn't a European level strategy on Afghanistan apart from the United States. And to use that example now to say we should have had a troop or we should have had airlift capabilities, I think overlooks the fact that that conversation hasn't taken place yet. Now, you can you argue, and I have some colleagues that do, that you need the capabilities first before you can come up with a strategy. I think that's a fair point to make. But I just looking at the efforts that we're currently undertaking in terms of building up those capabilities, I fear that we're now investing in defense and it's not, but not doing it with a view to filling broader European capability gaps. And so I do think that strategy needs to come first.
Janusz Reiter.
This is a little bit like the traditional dispute in the EU between Germany and France. What is more important, institutions or policies? I think in this case, it is more about policies, or in our case, it's more about strategy. And I think Ursula von der Leyen rightly said that the key problem in Europe is the political will. How do we get a common political will? In other words, the key problem also is how do we organize a leadership? We do not have these debates in NATO because but there has been a leader whose leadership position has been criticized, but well, actually everybody has been happy to have this power as a leader. Well, who will make the Europeans happy by taking the leadership in Europe? What country, what nation will be accepted by everybody as the leader? And how do we organize the leadership? By saying that, I'm not questioning again the need for more European ability to act. But we have to be aware of our limits, and we will not just overcome these limits that have their origin in our history. We have to be realistic. So, as much as I believe in Europe able to act more, I really believe that we have to focus now on digital, well, autonomy or sovereignty, call it as you like, technology, all these issues that are of real, of relevance, importance for the future of Europe, but we should not touch the sensitive, emotional issues that have their roots in our shared history.
That's a wonderful way for us to bring this session to an end. I won't try to summarize things, but I think a few things that I take away from today's discussion. One is that there will be, I think it is entirely likely we will see a continued German commitment both to the transatlantic relationship and also to European integration. That's pretty clear. Questions about the level of European ambitions, certainly. The question of public and elite opinion, I think we've talked about a bit and is a significant one for future debates about issues that could arise. And I think the nuclear sharing question is one that bears watching, even though it's not a campaign issue per se. It's one that could become quite significant in the post-election context. And I think that is perhaps the last point I will make, is that the interesting things really begin on the evening of September 26th and looking forward, because the negotiation of a coalition and the compromises that will go into it are going to be enormously significant for the policies that the German government will follow after this election takes place. And we look forward at AICGS to being with you and having you with us as we go through those days, weeks, months of the formation of a new German government to focus on the issues that are most important, not only for the transatlantic relationship. I want to thank my colleague Gail Maddox, who directs our foreign and security policy program, for the idea and for working to bring this session together. I also want to thank the US diplomatic missions in Germany for their support to us that enables us to hold this webinar. I want to thank all of you out there for your terrific questions and engagement in today's discussion. Most of all, thanks to Ulrike Franke, Janusz Reiter, and Sophia Besch for being our experts today. And we look forward to seeing all of you again soon. Thanks so much, and take care.